the night is vast, and above the endless steppe, the stars burn like scattered embers across the black sky. Wind moves the tall grass in slow waves, as if the earth itself were breathing, and from far away, faint at first, then louder, comes the thunder of hooves. This is the sound that once shook the frontiers of Europe. It is the echo of the Cumans. They were children of the steppe, born to the saddle, raised beneath the open sky. Their lives were measured not by walls or cities, but by the rhythm of migration, the hunt, and the horse. They slept in felt tents, carried their homes on wagons, and let the horizon be their fortress. For centuries, no empire could truly bind them. Instead, it was the Cumans who arrived at the borders of empires, testing their strength, shaping their fate. Imagine the scene: Byzantine envoys riding out to parley with men whose bows could sing death from 100 paces, or Rus's princes watching the smoke of Cuman camps rising beyond the rivers. To friend and foe alike, they were both traders and raiders, mercenaries and enemies, always unpredictable, always mobile. But history moves like the steppe winds, gentle one moment, storming the next. From obscurity, the Cumans rose to command vast lands stretching from the Don to the Danube. Yet, even at their height, shadows gathered in the east. Riders fiercer still would descend, led by a Khan whose name shook the world, Chinggis. And when Mongol hooves thundered, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Tonight, we follow the rise and fall of the Cuman Civilization, a people of horse and bow, of open grasslands and fleeting power. Their story is not carved in stone or marble, but carried in the memory of chronicles, in fragments of folklore, and in the mechanics of a strategy game where their cavalry still charges. Close your eyes and listen, for once again, the hooves are coming. The origins of the Cumans begin not in palaces or temples, but in the boundless wilderness of the Eurasian steppe, stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, from the Volga to the Carpathians. This was a world without walls. Grasslands rolled on for hundreds of miles, punctuated only by rivers, patches of woodland, and the occasional burial mound rising like a silent sentinel. It was here, in this ocean of grass, that the Cumans first took form. They were part of the Turkic migrations, a people born from the east and carried westward by the tide of history. Around the 10th and 11th centuries, they appeared on the frontiers of Kievan Rus and Byzantium, already skilled horsemen and masters of the bow. Their name itself, Cuman, or Polovtsian in the Rus chronicles, spoke of their lighter hair and complexion compared to other steppe peoples. To their enemies, they were strangers from the horizon. To themselves, they were simply riders of the open land. Life on the steppe was harsh, but it gave birth to resilience. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk, their small hands clutching the mane of a pony as the wind carried them forward. By the age of 10, they could fire arrows from horseback with deadly accuracy. Survival depended on constant movement. Herds of sheep, cattle, and horses had to be driven across pastures in rhythm with the seasons. To stay too long in one place was to invite hunger, or worse, invasion. The Cumans inherited much from the peoples who had roamed the steppe before them: Scythians, Huns, Pechenegs. But unlike those who came and vanished, the Cumans would leave a longer mark. Their loose confederation of tribes allowed them to adapt quickly, uniting under charismatic leaders when threatened, dispersing again when danger passed. This flexibility made them elusive enemies. They could vanish into the steppe as quickly as they appeared. Imagine a border village in Kievan Rus around the year 1050. Farmers harvesting their grain might look up to see dust on the horizon. Within hours, riders would be upon them swift, terrifying, and gone before the defenders could muster. Chronicles describe these raids with fear. Yet they also record moments of uneasy alliance. At times, the princes of Rus hired Cuman mercenaries to fight their rivals. The line between enemy and ally blurred with each shifting season. This duality, the ability to be both destroyer and partner, was a defining trait of the Cumans. It made them feared, but also indispensable. Byzantium, ever pragmatic, welcomed Cuman horsemen into its service. Hungary, though often at war with them, would later grant them land and refuge. And as we will see, this talent for adaptation would decide their fate when the Mongols came thundering. But before the Mongol storm, there was the Cuman dawn. Their songs spoke of endless sky, of freedom that only the steppe could grant. Their shamans invoked the spirits of wind and fire. Their leaders measured strength not in walls or gold, but in horses, warriors, and the loyalty of clans. And already, by the late 11th century, whispers spread across Europe of this new power on the horizon. A people who seemed to emerge from nowhere, yet whose presence would soon be felt from the Black Sea to the gates of Vienna. The Cumans were on the rise, and history was about to bend beneath their hooves. But this was only the beginning. To understand the Cumans, one must first understand the rhythm of the steppe. Life was not anchored in stone, nor rooted in soil, but carried on wheels and hooves. Their world was a landscape of movement. To stand still was to perish. At the heart of this nomadic existence was the yurt, the felt tent that rose like a small dome against the endless sky. Its wooden frame could be dismantled and loaded onto wagons in a matter of hours. Families carried their homes with them, following the grass that fed their herds. Within the yurt, life was simple but deeply communal. A fire burned in the center, smoke escaping through the roof, warmth radiating against the chill winds of the plains. Here, children listened to the songs of their elders, tales of spirits, ancestors, and the deeds of warriors long gone. The horse was more than a companion, it was the very foundation of life. Herds of shaggy ponies grazed freely, and every Cuman child learned to ride as soon as they could stand. Horses provided milk, meat, and mobility. Without them, there was no Cuman. They enabled swift raids and equally swift retreats, turning the steppe into both shield and sword. Clothing was practical tunics of wool and leather, boots lined with fur, cloaks against the cold. Yet even here, artistry emerged. Women embroidered patterns that carried meaning, symbols of protection, fertility, or clan identity. Jewelry of bronze and silver adorned necks and arms, proof that even a people forever on the move sought beauty in the fleeting. Seasons dictated every decision. Spring brought migrations toward fresh pastures. Summer was for gathering strength and trading at frontier markets. Autumn demanded preparations for the bitter cold. Winter pressed hard, testing survival itself. The Cumans adapted, as their ancestors had, reading the signs of the sky and the earth. A sudden snowstorm could wipe out herds. A drought could send whole clans wandering west in search of survival. But the nomadic life was not only hardship, it carried freedom unknown to peasants, bound to fields or towns locked within walls. The horizon was infinite. The sky, their cathedral. The wind, their companion. The Cumans moved as the seasons moved. Never fully bound. Never fully conquered. This freedom, however, came with tension. To sedentary neighbors, the nomads were both exotic and terrifying. How could a people without cities wield such power? How could they vanish so quickly, only to return in greater numbers? For farmers of Kievan Rus or merchants of Byzantium, the Cumans embodied both opportunity and danger. Trade caravans carried furs, horses, and slaves across the steppe. Yet the same riders could plunder those caravans if alliances shifted. Even in peace, the Cumans remained unpredictable. Their khans might pledge loyalty to one prince, then turn to another. But beneath this shifting politics lay the unchanging core of their culture, of loyalty to kin, to horse, to freedom. And so, as the 11th century deepened, the nomadic life of the Cumans became both their strength and their vulnerability. It allowed them to range across half a continent, striking fear into their neighbors. Yet it also left them without the fortresses and walls that might one day resist a greater storm. For on the horizon, beyond the eastern rivers, another people stirred. Their hooves too would thunder. Their yurts too would rise against the sky. But they carried an ambition unlike any before. When they came, the Cumans would discover that the freedom of the steppe could not always outrun destiny, but that was still to come. For now, in the second age of their story, the Cumans lived as the wind itself, free, restless, and untethered. If the yurt was the heart of Cuman life, then the horse archer was its fist. Every Cuman man was, first and foremost, a warrior of the steppe. Their armies were not made of rigid ranks or heavy infantry, but of riders who seemed to move like the wind itself, swift, elusive, and deadly. The weapon that defined them was the composite bow, crafted from layers of horn, wood, and sinew. It was short enough to fire from horseback, but powerful enough to pierce armor at a distance. Cuman riders could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed, turning in the saddle to unleash arrows even as they retreated. This made them masters of the feigned flight, pretending to flee, luring enemies into pursuit, only to wheel around and rain arrows upon them. Their armies did not march like those of Byzantium or the Rus. Instead, they flowed across the steppe in waves, each clan contributing its own contingent. A single warband could vanish into the grass, then reappear 100 miles away, striking where least expected. Chronicles of Kievan Rus describe how entire armies struggled to pin them down. Villages could be raided, rivers crossed, and enemies defeated long before reinforcements arrived. And yet, this was not chaos. It was strategy born of the nomadic way of life. To fight like a Cuman was to fight as one with the steppe. Horses were bred for endurance, able to travel long distances without rest. Riders carried spare mounts, switching mid-journey to keep their momentum. The land itself was their ally, its rivers, hills, and endless grass their shield. In Age of Empires II, the Cumans are remembered through their unique units and playstyle. Their Kipchak horse archers, fast-firing and relentless, echo the tactics of their ancestors. Their civilization bonuses emphasize mobility and the ability to strike quickly, just as their real armies had done. To play as the Cumans is to embrace speed, to harass and overwhelm before the enemy can build defenses. It is history translated into gameplay, but the Cuman warrior was more than just a bowman. Spears and sabers were carried for close combat. Lances, leveled in full charge, could break enemy lines. Drums and horns signaled maneuvers across the battlefield, while banners, brightly painted, adorned with totems, rose above the dust of battle. Their warfare was also psychological. To sedentary foes, the sight of thousands of horsemen sweeping across the plain was a storm of terror. Still, war for the Cumans was not endless destruction. Raiding was survival, but so too was negotiation. A Khan might fight one day and accept tribute the next. The same men who burned a frontier town might later be found guarding a prince as hired mercenaries. In this, the Cumans mirrored the dual nature of the steppe itself, at once nourishing and unforgiving. But war carried seeds of destiny. The very skills that made the Cumans feared also ensured that greater powers took notice. Byzantium enlisted them as allies, paying for their service in gold and silk. The princes of Rus alternately cursed and courted them, never certain whether the riders would return as friends or foes. In Hungary and Poland, their name became synonymous with both danger and opportunity. And behind this constant movement, one question lingered: could a people so tied to mobility ever build something permanent? Could they transform from warriors of the wind into rulers of the earth? For now, the Cumans reigned supreme across the grasslands. Their bows sang, their horses thundered, their enemies trembled. Yet just beyond the eastern horizon, whispers already spoke of another cavalry, fiercer and more disciplined still. The Mongols were coming, and when they arrived, even the masters of the feigned flight would be forced to reckon with a storm greater than their own. But that moment was not yet. In this chapter of history, the Cumans stood as the unrivaled warriors of the steppe. By the close of the 11th century, the Cumans were no longer a shadow on the horizon. They had become a force that reshaped the map of Eastern Europe. Their riders swept westward, crossing rivers and steppes, pressing against the borders of kingdoms that had once looked outward with confidence. Now those same kingdoms looked eastward, anxiously, toward the lands of the horse lords. Their rise was not the story of a single Khan, but of a federation. Dozens of tribes, each led by its own chieftain, wove together in loose alliances, uniting only when opportunity demanded. This flexibility was their strength. When a Rus prince launched a campaign, Cumans could disperse, vanishing into the vastness of the steppe. When the tide turned, they regrouped with terrifying speed, striking weak points before retreating once more. Contemporary chronicles describe their sudden appearance with awe and fear. The primary chronicle of Kievan Rus tells of raids so swift that villages were left smoldering before messengers could even warn the nearest stronghold. Yet in the same breath, these texts mention Cumans standing side by side with Rus princes, fighting against rival clans or ambitious brothers. To the Rus, The Cumans were both scourge and salvation foes one season, allies the next. This pattern repeated along the borders of Byzantium. The empire had long experience with steppe peoples, from Huns to Bulgars to Pechenegs. With the Cumans, diplomacy became a weapon as vital as the sword. Byzantine emperors paid them in gold, gifted them titles, and even sealed alliances with marriages. For a time, Cuman horsemen served in imperial armies. Their bows turned against the empire's other enemies. Yet just as easily, they could return to raiding when the flow of wealth faltered. Their influence stretched further still. Across the Black Sea, Cumans clashed with Georgian kings, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as mercenaries. They left their mark in place names, in fragments of folklore, in the fear that rippled through borderlands from the Caucasus to the Carpathians. The steppe, once a distant frontier, had become the beating heart of uncertainty in medieval Europe. But rise is never without cost. The very success of the Cumans invited new challenges. Their raids grew bolder, provoking coalitions of resistance. Their alliances, though powerful, were unstable. A Khan might secure peace with Hungary one year, only for another Cuman leader to attack the same kingdom the next. To sedentary rulers, the Cumans seemed like the wind, impossible to contain, but also impossible to trust. And yet, in this period of ascendancy, the Cumans flourished. They commanded vast herds, controlled key trade routes, and influenced politics across half a continent. They were no longer simply nomads of the steppe, they were power brokers, feared and courted by kings and emperors alike. In the language of Age of Empires II, this was their castle age, the moment when their civilization reached its height. Poised between expansion and confrontation, their cavalry dominated the field. Their presence tilted the balance of wars, and for a time, it seemed that the horizon itself belonged to them. But history is never static. From the east, another tide was gathering strength, disciplined, ruthless, united under a vision larger than any single tribe. When that tide crashed upon the steppes, it would test whether the rise of the Cumans was a prelude to empire or a fleeting spark before the storm. For now, though, the Cumans stood tall. The sound of their hooves echoed from the Volga to the Danube. The rise of the steppe riders was complete. For all their fearsome reputation as raiders, the Cumans were more than destroyers of villages and scourges of kingdoms. They were also connectors, linking the vast steppes of Eurasia with the markets and courts of settled Europe. If their horses carried arrows, they also carried goods, messages, and alliances. To understand their place in history, one must see the Cumans not only as warriors, but as diplomats and traders who stood astride two worlds. Along the great rivers, the Dniester, the Dnieper, the Don, the Cumans established seasonal camps that became points of exchange. Caravans laden with furs from the north, silks from the east, and wine from the south passed through their territories. Horses were among their most prized commodities, bred for endurance and speed. Cuman steeds were sought after by Rus princes, Byzantine generals, and even merchants who valued mobility across rough terrain. Slaves, too, were a grim but profitable part of this trade, as captives from raids were sold into markets stretching from Constantinople to Cairo. But trade was only one form of power. Diplomacy was another. The Cumans quickly mastered the art of negotiation. Realizing that fear alone could not sustain their influence, their Khans arranged marriages with neighboring dynasties, weaving bonds that were harder to break than treaties. The Hungarian monarchy, in particular, forged deep ties with the Cumans. By the 13th century, entire groups of Cuman families were welcomed into Hungary. Their warriors integrated into royal service. Their daughters married into noble houses. These unions were not merely symbolic, they ensured that Cuman blood flowed in the veins of European kings. One striking example was Elizabeth the Cuman, who became Queen Consort of Hungary in the mid-13th century. Through her, the nomadic riders of the steppe found a place at the heart of European dynastic politics. What had once been a people feared for their raids now shaped the very lineage of kingdoms. The Byzantines, masters of intrigue, also played this game. They alternated between hiring Cuman mercenaries and bribing their chieftains, always careful to balance loyalty with caution. For the empire, the Cumans were both a sword to wield and a storm to appease. Diplomacy meant survival on both sides, as neither could afford endless war. Even in Kievan Rus, where the memory of raids ran deep, diplomacy took root. Princes often employed Cuman allies in civil wars against their rivals. Chroniclers note that entire campaigns could turn on whether a Khan chose to ride in support of one claimant or another. The Cumans were not mere raiders at the gates, they were kingmakers, their shifting loyalties reshaping the politics of Rus lands. And yet, this delicate balance carried risks. To be courted by many was to be trusted by none. The very flexibility of Cuman diplomacy made them seem unreliable. Agreements could dissolve overnight. Alliances could be betrayed by dawn. For kingdoms that valued permanent stone walls, written treaties, lasting institutions, the Cumans embodied the uncertainty of the wind. Still, there is something profoundly human in their story. A people without cities, without chronicles of their own, they nonetheless carved a place in the politics of Europe through skill, presence, and necessity. They may not have left great monuments, but their imprint lay in the shifting marriages, the fleeting alliances, the echoes of their language in borderlands where they once camped. In the world of Age of Empires too, this diplomatic fluidity is harder to capture than cavalry charges. Yet it is there in the way Cumans are designed to be versatile, adapting quickly, striking fast, and finding opportunity in moments of imbalance, just as in history. Their strength lies in flexibility, but history, like trade, is transactional. The Cumans' role as brokers of power brought them influence, but also enemies. To some, they were partners. To others, perpetual threats. And while marriages and treaties extended their reach, they could not build the walls that might withstand what was to come. For already, by the early 13th century, a shadow had fallen across the eastern horizon. Merchants whispered of horsemen even fiercer than the Cumans, an empire rising that demanded submission, not negotiation. Soon, diplomacy would not be enough, but that storm had not yet arrived. In this chapter of their story, the Cumans stood at the crossroads of trade and diplomacy. Riders who carried not only bows but also the weight of kingdoms in their decisions. By the dawn of the 12th century, The Cumans were no longer distant riders haunting the horizon. They had become a storm pressing against the gates of Europe itself. Their raids reached deeper into Hungary, Poland, and the lands of Kiev and Rus, shaking kingdoms that had once believed themselves secure behind rivers, castles, and forests. The clash with Kiev and Rus was especially fierce. Chroniclers describe year after year of raids and counter-raids. Border villages lived in constant fear. Their wooden palisades no match for swift horsemen. Yet just as often, Rus princes hired the very same Cumans to aid them in civil wars, turning enemies into allies with the promise of silver, cattle, or marriage. This strange cycle raid, alliance, betrayal defined much of the relationship. For the Cumans, it was survival. For the Rus, it was necessity. Hungary felt the pressure most acutely. Its plains, so similar to the steppe, offered little defense against cavalry. Cuman riders crossed the Danube, pillaging and retreating before royal armies could respond. Kings sought to repel them with fortresses and knights, but the Cuman speed often outpaced these measures. In time, however, Hungary found another solution: integration. By welcoming Cuman warriors into service, by marrying Cuman women into noble families, they turned foes into allies. It was a gamble, but one that would reshape the kingdom for centuries. Poland too felt the sting of Cuman raids. Chronicles tell of sudden attacks on towns and monasteries, of horsemen appearing without warning, then vanishing beyond the forests. Yet even here, diplomacy intervened. Polish rulers, like their Rus and Hungarian counterparts, sometimes sought Cuman support against rivals. The horse lords of the steppe became both scourge and savior, a paradox that made them impossible to ignore. To European chroniclers, the Cumans were often portrayed as barbarians, fierce, unpredictably, lacking the trappings of civilization. Yet behind the fear lay grudging respect. Their skill as horsemen, their mastery of strategy, their ability to endure the hardships of the steppe impressed even their enemies. Some compared them to the ancient Scythians or Huns, heirs to a long tradition of steppe conquerors. But the Cumans were not simply shadows of the past. They were shaping the present. Their influence reached deep into politics, forcing kings and princes to adjust strategies, to fortify borders, to reconsider alliances. In many ways, the Cumans acted as a catalyst, compelling Europe to adapt. Without the constant pressure of steppe raids, perhaps fortifications would not have spread so rapidly, nor knights been forced to refine their tactics. In Age of Empires too, this tension between speed and solidity is mirrored in gameplay. Cumans excel in mobility, but their lack of strong fortifications makes them vulnerable in prolonged battles. History reflects the same paradox. The Cumans could terrify Europe with sudden strikes. Yet when confronted by armies that learned to withstand their assaults, their weakness was revealed. Still, for more than a century, the Cumans held the advantage. They raided when opportunity arose, allied when it suited them, and retreated when necessary. Their presence at the gates of Europe was both a curse and a warning, a reminder that no border was safe, no kingdom beyond reach. And yet, as the 13th century approached, cracks appeared. The very adaptability that had long served the Cumans began to falter. internal divisions, shifting loyalties, and the lure of permanent settlement weakened the unity of the tribes. And beyond the eastern horizon, an empire unlike any before was gathering its riders. The Mongols were coming. Their hooves would not stop at raiding villages or demanding tribute. They would come for conquest. Absolute and unrelenting. And when they arrived, the Cumans, so long the terror of Europe, would find themselves on the other side of fear. But that storm still lay in the distance. For now, in the early 12th century, the Cumans stood defiant at the very gates of Europe, horsemen of the wind pressing against the stone walls of kingdoms, forever changing the course of medieval history. In the shifting sands of medieval politics, the Cumans learned early that survival depended not only on speed of the horse but also on flexibility of allegiance. They lived in a world of fragile treaties and sudden betrayals, where today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally. Among the steppe riders, loyalty was not measured in centuries or dynasties, but in seasons and opportunity. One of their most frequent partners and adversaries was the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium had long been accustomed to the arrival of nomads at its borders, from Huns to Avars to Pechenegs. The empire had faced wave after wave of steppe peoples. With the Cumans, it pursued its usual mix of diplomacy and pragmatism. Gold was offered. Mercenary contracts were signed. Marriages arranged. Cuman cavalry often rode under Byzantine banners, their arrows loosed against the enemies of Constantinople. Yet the partnership was uneasy. If imperial payments faltered or politics shifted, those same riders could turn their bows against Byzantine lands. The Bulgars, too, knew both sides of Cuman power. As neighbors on the steppe frontier, they experienced raids that devastated villages and strained defenses. Yet at times, Cuman allies proved invaluable against common enemies, particularly during the region's turbulent struggles for dominance. In Bulgarian chronicles, the Cumans appear alternately as scourges and saviors, symbols of chaos, yet also of deliverance. Perhaps the most complex relationship of all was with the Kipchaks. In many sources, the two names are used interchangeably, for the Cumans were part of the broader Kipchak confederation that dominated the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Their identities overlapped, their tribes intermingled, and together they created what later historians would call the Cuman-Kipchak Union. To their neighbors, the distinction mattered little. To the riders themselves, it was a tapestry of clans bound by language, culture, and the horse. Yet even among allies, rivalry simmered. Tribal independence remained paramount, and unity existed only so long as shared threats endured. When pressure eased, disputes over pastures or spoils could set clans against one another. The strength of the Cumans lay in their ability to unite swiftly under danger, but their weakness was the equally swift return to disunity once that danger passed. European chroniclers often struggled to capture this fluid reality. To them, the Cumans seemed duplicitous, treacherous, incapable of lasting loyalty. But, from the perspective of the steppe, it was not treachery, it was survival. The Cumans understood that in a world where borders shifted and empires rose and fell, only flexibility could endure. This balancing act shaped the destiny of kingdoms around them. A Rus prince who secured Cuman aid might triumph in battle. only to face betrayal when another rival offered a richer bargain. Byzantine emperors who hired Cuman mercenaries risked raids if tribute was delayed. Hungarian kings who welcomed Cumans into their service also feared the unrest they brought. Allies and enemies were two sides of the same coin, tossed endlessly on the winds of politics. In the logic of Age of Empires 2, this flexibility appears as adaptability. The Cumans can boom quickly, rush early, or shift strategies mid-game. They are not bound to one rigid path but thrive in unpredictability. History mirrors this. The Cumans' greatest weapon was not only their bow or horse, but the uncertainty they created in the minds of others. Yet this very uncertainty carried a price. Over time, it eroded trust. Neighboring powers, while forced to deal with the Cumans, rarely embraced them fully. Integration was partial, alliances temporary. Even in Hungary, where Cumans were settled in large numbers, suspicion lingered for generations. The memory of raids, the image of steppe horsemen, could not be easily erased. Still, during their height, the Cumans managed to insert themselves into every major struggle of their age. They were there in the civil wars of Rus, on the battlefields of Byzantium, in the courts of Hungary. Sometimes they tipped the balance, other times they were swept aside, but always they remained present, the unpredictable variable in the equation of medieval power. And yet, for all their alliances, one enemy could not be bargained with. From the east, a storm gathered that offered neither gold nor treaty. The Mongols demanded submission, not partnership. When they came, the old game of allies and enemies would collapse into something far more brutal: conquest. For the Cumans, accustomed to a world of shifting loyalties, this would be the greatest test of all. For generations, the Cumans had been the terror of frontiers. Their hooves thundered across the steppes, their arrows darkened the skies, and their presence shaped the destinies of kingdoms from Rus to Byzantium. But in the early 13th century, the storm they had long unleashed upon others came for them. And this storm bore a single name: the Mongols. The first encounters were warnings of what was to come. Scouts reported riders from the east, disciplined and relentless, their banners marked with strange symbols, their horses smaller but tireless. At first, the Cumans treated them as they had every other steppe rival, with caution, raids, and the expectation that victory or retreat would eventually decide the matter. But the Mongols were different. They did not vanish after defeat, nor scatter after setbacks. They returned, again and again, each time more organized, more determined, more ruthless. In 1223, the clash came to a head at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Cumans, seeking aid, turned to their occasional allies, the princes of Kievan Rus. Together, they mustered a force meant to repel the new threat. But the Mongols were masters of deception. Finding retreat, they lured the Rus-Cuman coalition into pursuit, then turned and struck with devastating force. The allied army was annihilated. For the Cumans, it was a disaster. The tactics they had once perfected, the feigned flight, the sudden ambush, had been turned against them with chilling efficiency. From that moment, the Mongols were no longer a distant threat. They were a tidal wave rolling west. Cuman camps burned, their herds scattered, their warriors slain or driven into flight. Entire clans were uprooted, forced to flee across the steppe into foreign lands. Hungary became the destination for many, where kings, once beset by Cuman raids, now offered them refuge in exchange for military service. Yet, even there, suspicion and unrest followed. Integration was uneasy, trust fragile. The Mongol storm was more than conquest, it was annihilation. Unlike other enemies, the Mongols did not simply raid and retreat. They absorbed, exterminated, or enslaved. Where Cumans once boasted of freedom and mobility, they now faced an enemy who mastered the same arts, but with greater discipline and under a single unifying vision. Against such unity, the loose tribal confederation of the Cumans could not hold. In the chronicles of Europe, this was the moment the Cumans began to fade as an independent force. Their name survives in fragments, their leaders mentioned as exiles, refugees, or mercenaries. The Mongols had not only defeated them, they had erased their autonomy, scattering their people into the histories of others. Some found new lives in Hungary, their descendants merging into European nobility. Others served within the Mongol Empire itself, their cavalry absorbed into the armies they once fought. In Age of Empires, too, this chapter of history is harder to play out, for no strategy game can fully capture the terror of facing an enemy who has perfected your own tactics. But in the echoes of gameplay, one can imagine it, the fast-moving horse archers of the Cumans suddenly outclassed by an opponent even swifter, even deadlier, even more disciplined. It is a reminder that on the steppe, supremacy was never permanent. And yet, there is tragedy here, beyond strategy. Imagine a Cuman elder, standing at the edge of his burning camp, watching the horizon where Mongol banners rise. He has lived his life believing the wind could never be captured, that the steppe would always belong to those who rode it. Now he sees that even the wind can be tamed. If harnessed by a storm greater than his own, the Mongol conquest did not simply defeat the Cumans, it transformed them. No longer the masters of the steppe, they became wanderers, allies, and survivors. Their story, once written in raids and victories, turned into one of endurance and adaptation. And though the Mongol storm passed, its mark remained. For the Cumans, there would be no return to their old freedom. They had entered history as lords of the wind. They would leave it as echoes, scattered across the lands they once terrorized. When the Mongol storm swept across the steppes, it scattered the Cumans like dust in the wind. Their once proud confederation shattered, their warriors either slain, enslaved, or driven into exile. Yet history rarely ends in a single battle. For the Cumans, survival did not come through victory, but through adaptation, through becoming part of other people's stories. Many fled westward into Hungary, where kings, once their enemies, now offered asylum. For King Belatupath, devastated by the Mongol invasion of 1241, the Cumans were both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, their cavalry offered vital military strength. On the other, their nomadic lifestyle and pagan traditions created friction with settled Christian populations. Still, necessity triumphed. whole Cuman clans were granted land on the Hungarian plains, where they gradually took root. Over time, assimilation deepened. The Cumans adopted Christianity, though traces of their old beliefs lingered in folklore. Their khans became nobles. Their daughters married into Hungarian dynasties. Perhaps the most famous legacy of this union was Elizabeth the Cuman, who became queen consort of Hungary in the 13th century. Through her, Cuman blood entered European royal lineages. What had once been the terror of Hungary now flowed in the veins of its monarchy. Elsewhere, Cumans found a place within the Golden Horde, the western arm of the Mongol Empire. Some clans submitted, serving as auxiliary cavalry in Mongol campaigns. To the Mongols, the Cumans were valuable precisely because they shared the same skills: mobility, endurance, mastery of the bow. In this way, Cuman identity blurred into the broader tapestry of steppe empires, their names surviving only in chronicles and place names. Language, too, left echoes. The Cuman tongue, a Turkic language, influenced neighboring peoples. A Cuman dictionary, the Codex Cumanicus, was compiled by missionaries, preserving fragments of their speech, prayers, and proverbs. In those words, one can still hear the rhythm of the steppe, the voice of a people who lived with the wind. But assimilation was not without tension. In Hungary, Cumans were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Their raids before the Mongol invasion were not easily forgotten. Conflicts flared between settlers and nomads, between Christian bishops and Cuman shamans. Yet gradually, as generations passed, differences softened. By the late Middle Ages, the Cumans were no longer outsiders. They were Hungarians, integrated into the fabric of the kingdom. Their survival through assimilation is both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because they endured when so many steppe peoples vanished entirely. Tragedy, because in surviving, they lost the independence that had defined them. The open steppe, the roaming herds, the endless migrations all faded into memory, replaced by fields, churches, and villages. In the mechanics of Age of Empires 2, this transformation is invisible. The Cumans remain forever riders of the steppe, their cavalry swift, their strategy aggressive. But history reminds us that civilizations evolve, sometimes into something unrecognizable. The Cumans did not vanish overnight. They melted into new identities, leaving behind fragments rather than monuments. And yet, those fragments matter. In place names across Eastern Europe, in surnames that trace back to Cuman ancestors, in the codex that preserves their words. The Cumans whisper still. Their assimilation did not erase them entirely. It ensured that, though diminished, they would never be forgotten. By the 14th century, few spoke of the Cumans as an independent people. They had become Hungarians, Mongols, or part of other nations. Their story had dissolved into the larger currents of history. But even in disappearance, there was survival. The echo of hooves remained, faint but unbroken, carried forward in bloodlines, in language, in memory. The Lords of the Wind had become part of the earth. The story of the Cumans does not end in conquest or in exile. Though their independence dissolved beneath the Mongol storm, Their legacy endured, woven into the histories of kingdoms, carved into chronicles, and carried in bloodlines across Europe. The horse lords of the steppe did not vanish entirely, they transformed, leaving behind echoes that still resound today. One of the clearest legacies lies in Hungary, where the Cumans settled in great numbers. Place names still preserve their presence. Kunmadaras, Kunsent Miklos, Nagy Kunszag regions that once marked their territories. For centuries, Cuman communities maintained their identity, practicing their traditions, even as they adopted Christianity and merged with Hungarian society. Their descendants became nobles, soldiers, and even queens. The fact that a nomadic people of the steppe could root themselves so deeply into a European kingdom speaks to their resilience. Their cultural memory also lives on in texts. The Codex Cumanicus, compiled by Franciscan missionaries in the late 13th century. It is more than a dictionary. It is a window into a vanished world. It records prayers in Cuman, Latin, and Persian, alongside proverbs that reflect the wisdom of the steppe. A horse is man's wings, one saying declares, capturing the spirit of a people for whom mobility was life itself. This manuscript ensures that, even as their language faded, the voice of the Cumans is not entirely lost. In folklore, the Cumans survive as both villains and heroes. In Rus chronicles, they are remembered as raiders, bringers of fire and fear. In Hungarian memory, they are both the disruptive nomads who once burned fields and the loyal warriors who later defended the kingdom. In truth, they were both an ambivalent legacy shaped by centuries of shifting alliances. But perhaps the most enduring mark of the Cumans lies in the broader story of the steppe civilizations. They were heirs to a tradition stretching back to the Scythians and Huns, and predecessors to later horse lords like the Tatars and Kazakhs. Each wave of nomadic riders carried something forward: tactics, culture, memory, the Cumans' mastery of mobility, their flexible tribal confederation, their dual role as raiders and mercenaries. All of these would influence the powers that followed. Even in the realm of popular culture and strategy games, the Cumans have found a strange immortality. In Age of Empires II Definitive Edition, they appear as a playable civilization. Their unique units, the Kipchak horse archers, mirroring their historical tactics. Their bonuses emphasize speed, early aggression, and adaptability, echoing the very qualities that made them both feared and admired in history. For players, the Cumans embody the thrill of striking fast and hard, the essence of the steppe captured in pixels and strategy. And so, their legacy is twofold, in the bloodlines of Europe and in the imagination of those who still remember the horse lords. They remind us that not all civilizations leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. Some leave behind whispers, names, fragments of language, strategies carried into the modern world through games and stories. Their monuments are not in stone, but in memory. The Cumans also teach a broader lesson about history itself. Power can be swift, dazzling, and terrifying, yet fleeting. The same hooves that once thundered across Europe were silenced within generations. What remains is not the empire they never built, but the influence they exerted, the traces they left in others' histories. Their story is not one of permanence, but of transformation. Imagine standing today on the Hungarian plain, where the sky still stretches endlessly above, where the wind still moves the grass in waves. In that landscape, one can almost hear the faint echo of hooves, the memory of riders who once seemed unstoppable. The Cumans may no longer exist as a people, but their spirit lingers, bound forever to the horizon of the steppe. They were the horse lords, the riders of the wind. And though their time has passed, their legacy endures, in place names, in texts, in blood, and in the imagination of all who hear their story. The steppe at night is quiet now. The wind still bends the grass in long waves. The stars still blaze above like cold fire. But the thunder of hooves has faded. Where once the Cumans roamed, only memory rides. Their story is not carved in marble or etched into towering monuments. It lingers instead in fragments in place names across Hungary, in the Codex Cumanicus that preserves their tongue, in the bloodlines of kings and queens who carry their heritage unseen. The horse lords of the steppe left no empire, but they left an imprint, subtle yet enduring, scattered across the map of Europe like seeds carried by the wind. In their rise, they embodied freedom, the infinite horizon, the life of movement, the bow and horse as extensions of the human spirit. In their fall, they revealed the fragility of that freedom when confronted by forces more united, more relentless. The Mongol storm showed that even the swiftest riders could be overtaken. And yet, in assimilation, they found a different kind of survival. History often remembers those who build in stone, who raise walls and towers to defy time. But the Cumans remind us that there is another kind of legacy one carried in motion, in influence, in the quiet persistence of memory. They were never meant to stand still. And perhaps that is why their story is harder to trace. Yet, in its very elusiveness, it is also haunting. Close your eyes and imagine the plain once more. Hear the faintest echo of hooves. Feel the rush of wind across the grass. For a moment, the Cumans return not as conquerors, not as exiles, but as whispers of a time when the steppe was theirs. And as you drift towards sleep, remember every civilization, no matter how fleeting, leaves its mark. The Cumans did not vanish. They ride still in stories, in names, in the imagination of those who listen.